On a March afternoon in 2019, cameras crowded into a Staten Island courtroom, lenses trained on a defendant who only days earlier had been unknown outside a single New York City borough. Deputies led in a young man in a rumpled jail uniform, his wrists bound. He was 24 years old, pale, slightly built, the sort of figure who might otherwise have disappeared into the background of any New York street. His name, Anthony Comello, had already ricocheted through national headlines, attached to an allegation as improbable as it was explosive, that he had gunned down a man federal authorities regarded as the acting boss of the Gambino crime family. When he reached the defense table, the young man made a small but unforgettable gesture. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand, turning the palm outward toward the room. Scribbled across his skin in thick ink were slogans and symbols linked to a swirl of online conspiracy theories and fervent support for the sitting president of the United States. Photographers, shutters snapped in frantic bursts. The image that emerged, a supposed assassin of a reputed mafia leader, holding up a hand marked with the letter Q, and phrases associated with the internet movement that called itself QAnon, seemed to fuse two very different eras of American anxiety into a single frame. For older New Yorkers, the reference point was the long shadow of traditional organized crime. Names like Gambino and Gotti, the raids and wiretaps, the courtroom showdowns that had once dominated tabloid front pages. For a younger generation, the ink on Comello's hand evoked a different world. Anonymous message boards, viral posts about deep state plots, a belief that hidden forces were guiding national events. How did a quiet, little-known construction worker from Staten Island end up at the intersection of those stories, accused of a high-profile killing and displaying the iconography of online extremism for the cameras? To understand that path, the story has to begin decades earlier, in the landscape that shaped his early life. Anthony Comello entered the world in the mid-1990s, at a time when New York City was undergoing a profound transformation. The crack epidemic that had ravaged neighborhoods in the 1980s and early 1990s was receding. Crime, which had once seemed a permanent feature of daily life, was falling year after year. The sensational mafia trials that put bosses like John Gotti behind bars were already part of recent memory. Federal racketeering cases had fractured the old hierarchies of the city's five families, and law enforcement pressure made the flamboyant, street-corner version of organized crime far less visible than it had been in earlier decades. Yet on Staten Island, where Comello grew up, the cultural memory of that world persisted. The borough, the least populated of New York's five, occupied a liminal space in the city's imagination. It was suburban but technically urban, geographically close to Manhattan yet psychologically distant, reachable by bridge or ferry but often described as the forgotten borough. Many residents were firefighters, police officers, sanitation workers, and small business owners. In certain neighborhoods, especially on the South Shore, Italian-American families who had moved out of Brooklyn over the years formed tight-knit communities. In those streets, stories about the mafia were part of the background noise of life, whether in jokes, cautionary tales, or the half-remembered gossip of older relatives. Social clubs that were once associated with mob figures had, in many cases, closed or blended into the ordinary commercial landscape. But the idea of the mob, its codes, its notoriety, its cinematic image, remained a familiar reference point. Young people of Comello's generation did not see the heyday of that world firsthand, yet they knew it as a kind of mythology, reinforced by films, television dramas, and family lore. Public records and later reporting provide only a partial sketch of Comello's early years, and there is no indication that his own family had any involvement in organized crime. On the contrary, investigators who pored over his background after his arrest would emphasize a fundamental point. There was no credible evidence linking him to any mob crew, and no sign that he had grown up inside the networks that law enforcement tracked as part of the Gambino family's operations. To the extent that he encountered the culture of organized crime at all, it was as a resident of a borough where its legacy loomed large in the collective imagination, not as a participant. What can be said with confidence is that he spent his childhood and adolescence in a modest, residential area on Staten Island's South Shore, living in the same house with his parents well into his adulthood. Neighbors would later describe a quiet household, unremarkable on its block. It was the kind of place where parents commuted to work, teenagers attended local public schools, and daily life was structured around family, church, sports, and the usual rhythms of a middle or working-class existence. There are no reliable public accounts of dramatic upheavals or early violent behavior in his youth, no record of a juvenile criminal history that foreshadowed the crime for which he would later be charged. Growing up in the late 1990s and 2000s, Comello belonged to the first generation of Americans to come of age entirely in the digital era. When he was still a child, the September 11 attacks shook New York and the country. Although he would have been too young to fully grasp the event as it unfolded, the years that followed wars abroad, color-coded terror alerts, televised debates about security and surveillance formed part of the atmosphere in which he matured. The financial crisis of 2008 arrived as he entered adolescence, bringing new uncertainty to families across the city. For young people like him, adulthood did not promise the straightforward upward mobility that earlier generations had expected. At the same time, access to the internet expanded rapidly. Home computers, smartphones, and social media began to shape how teenagers learned, socialized, and understood the world. Instead of relying solely on local institutions, schools, churches, neighborhood associations, for a sense of identity and information, they now encountered an endless stream of voices online. News outlets, commentators, entertainers, anonymous strangers. The boundaries between credible reporting, speculation, and outright fabrication were not always easy to discern, especially for those without strong guidance in digital literacy. Like many of his peers, Comello navigated this landscape while trying to carve out a place for himself in the physical world. He attended local schools on Staten Island, and according to reporting that followed his arrest, did not attract attention from authorities as a teenager for serious misconduct. Police databases revealed only minor infractions in the years that immediately preceded the 2019 killing, traffic violations, low-level encounters that did not signal a pattern of violent behavior. If law enforcement knew his name at all before his arrest, it was in the context of relatively routine matters that passed through municipal courts every day in a city of millions. In the absence of detailed personal testimony from his early life, observers can only outline the broad pressures that might have shaped a young man like him. Staten Island's political climate differed from much of the rest of New York City. It tended to vote more conservatively, and talk radio, cable news, and later online forums reflecting those views were widely consumed. National debates about immigration, crime, policing, and patriotism were intensely felt in a borough that provided many of the city's uniformed officers and emergency responders. Discussions of government, loyalty, and perceived betrayal by elites were not abstract. They were linked to the lived experiences and anxieties of families whose livelihoods depended on public institutions. For someone in Comello's position, a young adult without a clearly defined career trajectory, still living at home, doing manual work, it was easy to feel both part of and separate from this larger story. He was surrounded by symbols of stability and authority, the uniforms worn by neighbors, the knowledge that his borough played an important role in the city's functioning. Yet his own daily life, by accounts that would surface later, remained comparatively ordinary and uncertain. He worked in construction and related jobs, employment that reflected the trades common among Staten Islanders, but not the kind of professional path that came with obvious status or long-term security. Friends and acquaintances interviewed after his arrest painted a picture of a man who, for much of his youth, blended into the background. Some recalled him as quiet or shy, others as occasionally talkative but not especially remarkable. There were no widely reported accounts of early ideological extremism or well-developed political obsessions during his teenage years. If radical ideas were already beginning to take root in his mind, they were not yet visible enough to draw broader attention or intervention. The world around him, however, was becoming increasingly polarized. In the early 2010s, as he moved from adolescence into adulthood, American politics underwent a sharp shift in tone. Social media platforms amplified every controversy, rewarding outrage and spectacle. Online communities grew more insular and more intense, with users clustering around shared grievances and suspicions. Conspiracy theories, once confined to the fringes, found new life in viral videos and message boards, especially among users searching for simple explanations for complex social changes. During these years, Staten Island itself experienced its own set of strains. While crime remained far below the peaks of earlier decades, public debates raged over policing practices, development, and the borough's relationship with the rest of the city. Some residents felt neglected by City Hall, believing that their needs and values were misunderstood or ignored by political leaders based in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Local talk shows, community meetings, and online comment sections echoed with complaints about traffic, taxes, and perceived disrespect from the media. All of this formed the backdrop to Comello's early adult life. To describe it is not to claim that these conditions uniquely determined his actions, but to establish the context in which he searched for meaning and belonging. He was one young man in a sea of many, trying to construct a sense of self from the raw materials available: family expectations, neighborhood culture, national news, and an endless stream of content appearing on the screens he carried in his pocket. As he entered his 20s, those who knew him began to notice changes that, in retrospect, would take on a darker significance. He became more vocal about politics, increasingly engaged with online discussions, and more prone to making sweeping claims about government and hidden powers. These shifts did not happen overnight, and at first they might have seemed like the ordinary fervor of a young person discovering political beliefs. In a society marked by sharp divisions and constant media stimulation, intense opinions were hardly unusual. Yet under the surface, something more troubling appeared to be developing. Later, in the course of criminal proceedings, his defense attorney would point to episodes suggesting that he had become fixated on the idea that powerful figures in government, law, and media were part of a vast, corrupt plot against the country. He reportedly immersed himself in internet spaces where such ideas circulated, gravitating especially toward the sprawling, ever-changing theory that would come to be known as QAnon. In those circles, anonymous posts and cryptic messages were interpreted as revelations of a secret war between patriotic insiders and a shadowy, deep state. At this stage of his life, however, those beliefs and behaviors had not yet placed him at the center of national attention. To his neighbors, he remained the young man next door, living with his parents, coming and going in his truck, employed in physically demanding but modestly paid work. Staten Island streets, its strip malls and cul-de-sacs, continued their regular routine. The names of mafia figures that once dominated local whispers were now mostly invoked in the context of old stories. And the vast majority of people consuming conspiratorial content online did so without ever committing acts of violence. From the outside, there was little to indicate that Anthony Comello would be any different. The turning points that would bring him into collision with both the remnants of the old mafia world and the fevered dreams of online extremism still lay ahead. For the moment, he was a product of his time and place. A young man formed by a post-Cold War city, the lingering aura of organized crime, the economic insecurities of the early 21st century, and the disorienting echo chamber of the internet age. How those elements converged in one life, and how they eventually exploded into a crime that stunned even seasoned investigators, would only become clear in the years to come. As the decade wore on and the political climate in the United States grew more fevered, the changes in the wider culture were mirrored, in subtler ways, in the life of Anthony Comello. He had left high school behind without the kind of clear professional path that might have anchored him. Instead, like many young men on Staten Island, he moved into a patchwork of blue-collar work, construction jobs, shifts that depended on the rhythms of the local building trade, periods of relative stability followed by stretches of uncertainty. The work could be physically exhausting but not psychologically absorbing. Between jobs and in the evenings, the internet became a constant presence. The broader political environment of the mid-2010s was unlike anything in recent memory. The presidential campaign of 2016, the election of Donald Trump, and the intense coverage that followed flooded television and social media feeds with a constant barrage of argument and accusation. For supporters of the new president, Staten Island was one of the most congenial corners of New York City. It was the only borough that had voted for him, and many residents felt energized by his promises to drain the swamp and confront entrenched power in Washington. For his opponents, the same rhetoric sounded dangerous and destabilizing. Online, the polarization was even sharper. On forums, Facebook pages, YouTube channels, and image boards, a new ecosystem of political commentary thrived, often blurring the line between news and rumor, analysis and fantasy. Into that environment, in late 2017, came a set of cryptic posts on fringe message boards from an anonymous figure styling himself as Q, who claimed to have high-level government clearance. Those posts suggested that a secret group of patriots inside the government was working with the president to expose and defeat an alleged cabal of corrupt elites. The unfolding narrative promised that mass arrests were imminent, that shocking revelations would overturn conventional understandings of American politics, and that followers who deciphered Q's clues would be part of a historic awakening. This sprawling, constantly mutating belief system, soon dubbed QAnon, drew in a subset of already politicized internet users. It combined elements of older conspiracy traditions with contemporary grievances, offering simple, emotionally charged answers to complex social and political problems. Its followers were encouraged to do their own research, a phrase that often meant gravitating towards sources that reinforced the movement's assumptions, while dismissing mainstream reporting as part of the very plot they believed they were fighting. When law enforcement and journalists later examined Anthony Comello's digital trail, they found clear signs that he had been drawn deeply into this world. Social media accounts associated with him contained pro-Trump slogans, memes invoking QAnon themes, and references to the idea that a hidden deep state was working against the president and the country. He saved images and messages that echoed Q's vocabulary, including phrases suggesting that a dramatic reckoning was close at hand. Investigators would later describe his feeds as saturated with content from the movement, consumed with an intensity that went beyond casual interest. According to statements made later by his attorney, Comello did not merely consume this material. He began to interpret his own life through its lens. The defense would argue that he came to believe he had a special role to play in the battle he imagined was unfolding between patriots and traitors. Instead of viewing QAnon as commentary or speculation, he treated its claims as literal truth. In that mindset, public officials, judges, and even local law enforcement officers could appear not as ordinary professionals carrying out their jobs, but as potential enemies embedded within the deep state he thought he was meant to confront. Friends and acquaintances noticed that his conversations grew more agitated and more sweeping in their accusations. Where he had once discussed everyday matters, work, neighborhood gossip, sports. He increasingly steered talk toward politics and conspiracies. He spoke in the jargon of the online communities he frequented, mentioning the cabal and hinting darkly at secret crimes that he believed powerful figures were committing. Some people who knew him brushed this off as the kind of intense but ultimately harmless enthusiasm that many political partisans displayed in those years. Others felt unsettled by the fervor with which he delivered his claims, the sense that he no longer viewed disagreement as a simple difference of opinion, but as complicity in a vast wrongdoing. On paper, his official encounters with law enforcement during this period were still relatively minor. Records that surfaced after his arrest showed run-of-the-mill infractions, traffic violations, a failure to appear in court on a minor matter, the sort of bureaucratic friction that often accompanies a young adult's uneven transition into full responsibility. These incidents on their own did not suggest a trajectory toward extreme violence. They did, however, bring him into occasional contact with courts and officers, institutions that his evolving worldview was teaching him to see with deep suspicion. What changed in the crucial months before March 2019, according to court filings and accounts given by his lawyer, was not the frequency of his legal troubles but the framework through which he interpreted them. In the stories later told to judges and reporters, a picture emerged of a man who had come to regard himself as an agent of larger forces, someone authorized, perhaps even obligated, to take action where, in his view, the ordinary mechanisms of justice had failed. By early 2018 and into 2019, QAnon communities online were consumed with constant speculation that a wave of arrests of political and media figures was imminent. Every delay, every shift in the news cycle was explained away as part of an elaborate strategy. Followers who were deeply invested in the narrative sometimes struggled to reconcile the absence of visible mass arrests with the promises they had absorbed. One way of resolving that tension was to double down on belief, to assume that the plan was still advancing, hidden from public view. Another, more dangerous possibility was that some individuals would decide that they themselves had to begin enforcing what they saw as justice. According to his defense attorney, this latter impulse took hold in Comello's mind. In public statements, the lawyer described episodes in which Comello attempted what he called citizen arrests of people he believed were part of the corrupt elite he imagined. These accounts, later reported in the press, indicated that he had turned up at high-security locations in New York, including the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan and the official residence of the mayor, carrying handcuffs and expressing an intention to detain prominent figures. Security personnel confronted him, questioned him, and turned him away. In those instances, he was not charged with serious crimes. The episodes were treated more as odd, disruptive encounters than as immediate threats. When these events were later recounted in court, they were presented as early warning signs of a mind that was slipping away from consensus reality. To observers in retrospect, they seemed like clear markers of delusional thinking, the actions of someone who had come to believe that he possessed authority that no ordinary citizen actually holds. At the time, however, they were fleeting disturbances in a city that experiences countless strange incidents every week. For the officers and guards who dealt with him, Comello may have appeared eccentric or confused, but not necessarily as someone on the brink of committing a high-profile violent act. Meanwhile, in the same borough where Comello was struggling with these escalating beliefs, another man was living a very different life under the weight of a very different history. Francesco, Frankie Boy Cali, born in Sicily and raised partly in Brooklyn, had risen over the decades within the Gambino crime family, one of New York's traditional mafia organizations. By the 2010s, federal and local authorities regarded him as a key figure in the family's leadership, often described in press accounts as its acting boss. Cali's public persona bore little resemblance to the flamboyant, media-friendly mobsters of earlier generations. He lived quietly in a brick home in the Tot Hill section of Staten Island, an affluent enclave of large houses and winding streets. Neighbors saw a reserved man who kept a low profile, shuttling between home and a modest business presence, often in an SUV. Law enforcement, however, saw him as an important node in a network that, despite decades of prosecutions, still engaged in racketeering and other criminal activities. The old mafia hierarchy had been weakened but not eradicated. The contrast between the two men could hardly have been sharper. One was a middle-aged figure rooted in a fatting but still potent underworld tradition, operating within a tight-knit organization whose codes and relationships stretched back generations. The other was a young, digitally immersed construction worker, plugged into diffuse, leaderless online movements that rejected established institutions in favor of an imagined secret war. Their lives unfolded only a few miles apart on the same island. Yet there is no credible evidence that they had any connection or interaction before the months immediately preceding the crime that would bind their names together. As 2018 turned into 2019, national events fed the online obsessions that grip people like Comello. The country endured a prolonged partial government shutdown. Investigations into Russian interference in the 2016 election moved toward their public conclusions. For QAnon adherents, each headline was filtered through their theory. Every delay was proof of complexity. Every sealed court filing a potential sign that the long-awaited storm of arrests was near. On social media, hashtags and slogans associated with the movement proliferated, and its idea seeped into more mainstream conversation among the president's most ardent supporters. In this charged atmosphere, Comello's behavior, as described later in legal proceedings, grew more erratic. He reportedly spent long stretches consumed by online research, flipping between message boards, videos, and fringe news sites that reinforced his worldview. He became convinced, his lawyer said, that he was in direct communication with or receiving guidance from high-ranking officials, including the president himself. The boundary between online fantasy and offline reality, already thin in many corners of the internet, seemed to erode almost entirely in his case. Family members, according to accounts relayed through the defense, noticed that his thinking had become disordered. He spoke about needing to take action against enemies of the country, expressed fears that he was being monitored, and oscillated between grandiose plans and paranoia. These descriptions, emerging only after his arrest, suggest a young man in the grip of beliefs that were not simply controversial or extreme, but detached from verifiable reality. Yet, as is often the case with emerging mental health crises, the signs were ambiguous in the moment, and there is no public record indicating that he received sustained psychiatric treatment before the events of March 2019. Law enforcement would later try to piece together these developments from the outside. Social media archives, interviews with friends and relatives, and the notes and evaluations of psychologists who examined him after his arrest. The portrait that emerged differed sharply from the stereotype of a calculating, profit-driven criminal. Instead, it suggested an individual whose judgment was deeply compromised, whose sense of right and wrong had been distorted by a mixture of online propaganda and possible underlying mental illness. Still, until the evening when his path crossed with Francesco Cali's in the most consequential way, the official system regarded him as, at worst, a minor nuisance. His earlier attempts at citizen arrests, while unsettling, had not led to serious charges. His traffic cases and other low-level encounters did not trigger intensive supervision or intervention. In the enormous machinery of New York's courts and police departments, he was one of many thousands of young men who periodically brushed against the law without seeming to pose an exceptional danger. On Staten Island streets, life continued with its ordinary mix of concerns: commute times over the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, school budgets, local politics, and the ever-present debates about development and identity in a borough that often felt at odds with the rest of the city. In Tot Hill, residents drove past the quiet house of a reputed mafia leader without incident. In a more modest neighborhood miles away, a young construction worker scrolled through his phone, absorbing messages that convinced him the world was locked in a secret war and that he had a duty to act. In that gap between perception and reality, between the way institutions saw Anthony Comello and the way he saw himself, lay the seeds of the tragedy that would soon unfold. The systems that monitored organized crime kept close tabs on figures like Cali, whose movements and associations were of perennial interest to investigators. The systems that might have recognized the growing instability of a fringe-absorbed young man were far less focused, less equipped to distinguish between heated rhetoric and a deteriorating grasp on reality. By early 2019, those two stories, long separate, were moving inexorably toward a collision that few could have anticipated. On the evening of March 13, 2019, Tot Hill was doing what it usually did after dark, receding into quiet. The neighborhood, one of Staten Island's most affluent, sits on winding, tree-lined streets that look out toward the Narrows and the distant lights of Brooklyn. Brick and stucco houses with gated driveways give the area a subdued, almost suburban calm, far removed from the crowded avenues of Manhattan. In one of those houses, on Hilltop Terrace, Francesco "Frankie Boy" Cali, the man federal authorities believed to be the acting boss of the Gambino crime family, was spending an ordinary night at home with his family. Just after 9 o'clock, that quiet was broken by the sound of a collision. A pickup truck had struck a black SUV parked in front of Cali's house, reportedly a vehicle used by his household. The impact wasn't terrifyingly loud, but it was jarring enough to draw attention inside the home and from neighbors nearby. It looked, at first glance, like any number of minor car accidents that happen on residential streets. A distracted driver, a misjudged turn, a crunch of metal on metal. Inside, Cali stepped out to see what had happened. For a man with his history, any disturbance near his home would have carried extra weight. Decades earlier, another Gambino boss, Paul Castellano, had been shot dead on a Manhattan sidewalk, an event that had seared itself into the institutional memory of law enforcement and organized crime alike. But by 2019, such dramatic killings of high-ranking mafia figures were relatively rare. Cali himself had spent years cultivating a reputation for low-key conduct, avoiding the flashy displays that had made predecessors like John Gotti tabloid fixtures. Surveillance cameras mounted on the house and in the neighborhood captured what happened next, footage that investigators would later examine frame by frame. Cali walked down his driveway toward the street, where the pickup had stopped near his damaged SUV. The driver stepped out. At a distance, the two men appeared to speak calmly rather than in a heated confrontation. The driver gestured toward the vehicles, toward the license plate that had come loose in the impact. In some accounts, he seemed almost apologetic, a man acknowledging fault in a minor accident. The scene at that moment did not look like the start of a high-level mob assassination. There was no crew of backup shooters lingering nearby, no multiple vehicles boxing in the target, none of the elaborate staging that had often characterized past underworld hits. Just two men on a quiet street, one middle-aged and solid, the other younger and slimmer, their voices too low to be picked up clearly on camera. Then, in a sudden shift, the encounter turned lethal. As Cali moved near the back of his SUV, reportedly to inspect the damage or adjust the license plate, the driver of the pickup produced a handgun. In a flurry of motion captured by the cameras but not clearly audible, he fired multiple shots at close range. Cali staggered and fell onto the ground near the vehicle. The shooter ran back to the driver's side of the pickup, climbed in, and sped away down the street, leaving the older man gravely wounded in front of his own home. Neighbors rushed out at the sound of the gunfire. Someone called 911. Within minutes, police and emergency medical personnel arrived. The scene was chaotic but controlled, officers securing the area with tape and floodlights, paramedics working urgently to stabilize the victim and transport him to Staten Island University Hospital. Despite their efforts, doctors were unable to save him. Cali was pronounced dead a short time later, his life ending not in a secret backroom meeting or a remote hideout, but in front of the place where his children and relatives lived. News of the killing traveled quickly through internal police channels and then into the public sphere. When the identity of the victim began to circulate, the reputed acting boss of the Gambino family, the story exploded. For the first time since 1985, when Castellano had been gunned down outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, a sitting leader of a New York crime family had been assassinated on city streets. The initial headlines reflected that shock. References to mob boss, execution, and assassination appeared across major outlets. At first blush, it was natural for observers to assume that the killing was an internal mafia matter, perhaps a power struggle, a dispute over money, or a long-simmering grievance finally resolved in violence. Commentators dusted off the familiar tropes, talk of old-school hits, speculation about whether a rival faction within the Gambinos or another of the five families had moved against Cali. Retired investigators and prosecutors were called by reporters to offer theories. Many emphasized that, although law enforcement had severely weakened traditional organized crime, it had never eradicated it entirely. But even in those first hours, seasoned detectives on the ground noticed details that didn't quite fit the standard template of a mob-ordered assassination. The use of a single shooter who personally engaged the target in a staged fender bender, with no obvious backup team and a conspicuous vehicle, was unorthodox. The apparent lack of professional backup, the brazen method in a heavily surveilled residential neighborhood, the carelessness of driving right up to the victim's home, these features raised questions. Crime scene technicians combed the area in front of the house, collecting shell casings and photographing every angle. Ballistics analysis would later confirm that the weapon used was a 9 handgun, a common caliber. The surveillance footage from Cali's own home was secured almost immediately, giving investigators a clear if grainy view of the suspect and the vehicle. Neighbors' cameras and any city-installed systems in the vicinity were canvassed as well. In the modern investigative environment, a quiet street could still be densely mapped by private security systems and municipal infrastructure. As detectives began to review the video, a clearer image of the suspect emerged. The vehicle was a pickup truck, dark in color, with distinctive markings. The shooter appeared younger and slimmer than Cali, moving with the gait of a man in his 20s rather than a rival boss or long-established underworld figure. Still, in the early hours they treated the case as a possible organized crime hit. The victim's status demanded that level of scrutiny. Units experienced in mob investigations, both within the NYPD and at the federal level, took an interest. The media frenzy intensified. Television trucks arrived at Tot Hill, setting up near the entrance to Hilltop Terrace. Reporters interviewed neighbors, many of whom expressed shock that violence of this sort had reached their street. Some recalled seeing Cali as a quiet presence, a man who kept his yard tidy and his interactions polite. Others mentioned subtler signs of security awareness. The cameras, the limited visitors, the sense that this was not just another homeowner. To them, the idea that someone had lured him out with a staged collision and killed him in view of his family residence was both chilling and surreal. Inside police headquarters, detectives and analysts worked the case around the clock. One team focused on tracking the pickup truck, using the surveillance footage to determine the direction in which it fled, and then searching for additional cameras along that path. In New York, bridges, toll plazas, and some highways are equipped with license plate readers and traffic cameras that can provide crucial leads. Another team dug into Cali's recent communications and associations, looking for any sign of conflict or threat that might explain who wanted him dead. Early intelligence from organized crime sources did not point toward an internal war. Informants and wiretaps, already in place as part of ongoing investigations, did not suddenly light up with triumphant talk of a successful coup or impending realignment. If anything, people in and around the Gambino family seemed as surprised as anyone else. The lack of immediate celebratory chatter, combined with the oddities of the method, reinforced the sense that something atypical was at work. The truck, however, provided a more straightforward trail. By enhancing the footage and comparing it with registration databases, investigators were able to narrow down the make and model. It appeared to be a late-model Chevrolet pickup, dark blue or black, with specific design features on the rear and sides. Automatic license plate readers on Staten Island's major roadways and on the Verrazano Narrows Bridge were queried for pickups matching that description around the time of the shooting. Gradually, the list of potential vehicles shrank. Within days, detectives had identified a particular truck that appeared consistent with the one in the video and had been captured traveling between Staten Island and other parts of the region on the night in question. The vehicle was registered not to a shadowy shell company or a known mob associate, but to a family in Staten Island with no established links to organized crime. That alone was striking. When investigators looked more closely at who used the truck, one name began to stand out: a 24-year-old Staten Island resident named Anthony Comello. The moment that name surfaced, it meant little to most of the detectives on the case. He had no notorious track record, no long file in organized crime databases. A check of NYPD records showed only minor infractions and a few odd prior contacts with law enforcement. To be thorough, investigators pulled those reports. That was when a different pattern began to flicker into view. References to unusual behavior, confrontations at government buildings, and talk of citizens' arrests, rooted in conspiracy-minded rhetoric. Those earlier episodes alone did not prove involvement in the Cali killing, but they flagged Comello as someone worth urgent scrutiny. Detectives sought and obtained warrants to examine phone records associated with him and with the truck's movements. Data from cell towers, when aligned with the timestamp video, suggested that his device had been in the vicinity of Hilltop Terrace around the time of the shooting. It also appeared to show travel away from Staten Island shortly afterward. While this digital picture was coming into focus, physical surveillance was launched to locate Comello himself. He was not found at his usual address on Staten Island. Investigators learned of ties to a house in Brick Township, New Jersey, a shore area community where the Comello family spent time. With the cooperation of local authorities and federal marshals, a plan was made to approach that residence carefully. Given the gravity of the crime under investigation, the killing of a reputed mob boss, officers prepared for the possibility that the suspect might be armed or desperate. On March 16, 3 days after the shooting, law enforcement officers moved in on the Brick Township property. Accounts from that day describe a controlled operation rather than a pitched confrontation. Comello was taken into custody without a shootout or extended standoff. He appeared surprised but did not, in the available public record, mount violent resistance. Inside the house and the truck, investigators later reported finding items that, in their assessment, linked him to the Staten Island crime. Clothing matching that worn by the shooter in the surveillance footage, and other material evidence whose precise nature was not always fully detailed in public filings. News of the arrest broke quickly. The narrative that had dominated headlines, that of an underworld power play, shifted dramatically. Reporters now had a name and a face. A young, clean-shaven Staten Island construction worker, photographed in casual clothes during an earlier minor court appearance, his age and appearance starkly at odds with the imagined profile of a seasoned mob hitman. Authorities in New Jersey confirmed that he was being held pending extradition to New York to face charges related to the killing. As journalists began to look into his background, the story grew more complicated. Neighbors on Staten Island recognized his photo as the quiet young man from their street, someone they had seen getting into a pickup truck, not a figure they had ever associated with organized crime. Family acquaintances spoke cautiously to reporters, expressing disbelief that he could be involved in something so serious. Simultaneously, leaks from law enforcement sources highlighted his recent erratic behavior. The purported attempts at citizens' arrests, targeting public officials, his fixation on pro-Trump and QAnon-related themes, his apparent insistence that powerful figures were part of a vast hidden conspiracy. The arrest did not immediately answer the central question that had gripped investigators. Why would a young man with no verified ties to the Gambino family drive to the home of its acting boss and kill him in a manner that seemed, at once, both brazen and amateurish? In the early days after his capture, officials were cautious in public. At press conferences, NYPD leaders emphasized that they believed the motive was not connected to a traditional intra-family power struggle. They suggested that personal or idiosyncratic factors were likely at work, but refrained from spelling them out in detail. Behind the scenes, detectives and prosecutors spent long hours interviewing witnesses, analyzing digital evidence, and, crucially, speaking with the suspect himself. What emerged from those early interactions, and what would later be aired in court documents and attorney statements, was a tangled account in which Comello allegedly described his actions not as a mob contract killing, but as something he believed was sanctioned, even demanded by higher patriotic authority. He spoke, according to officials, in the language of conspiracy forums, invoking concepts of the deep state, and claims that he was acting to remove a dangerous figure. From a law enforcement perspective, the case was transforming from what had looked like the first major mafia assassination in decades into something stranger, a collision between an old-world crime family and a new-world form of radicalization, with a young man at the center who seemed untethered from shared reality. The killing itself remained a straightforward act in legal terms, a man shot and killed outside his home, an alleged perpetrator identified and arrested, charges of murder to be brought. But the narrative behind that act, the beliefs and delusions that might have led to it, were proving far more complex. In the days following his arrest, as arrangements were made for his transfer to New York, the public would get its first direct glimpse of the suspect. That appearance, and the messages he chose to display literally on his skin, would turn a Staten Island courtroom into a stage where the anxieties of an entire era, about organized crime, about online extremism, about truth and delusion, collided in a single, unsettling image. When officers brought Anthony Comello into a small New Jersey courtroom on March 18, 2019, he was, in legal terms, just a fugitive from justice. New York authorities had obtained a warrant accusing him of murdering Francesco "Frankie Boy" Cali. The purpose of this hearing in Ocean County was procedural, to confirm his identity and determine whether he would fight extradition. The room was modest, the charge technical. Yet within minutes, the scene would generate one of the most widely circulated images of the case, a photograph that seemed to crystallize the strangeness of the story in a single frame. Wearing a light-colored jumpsuit, his wrists cuffed in front of him, Comello was led to the defense table. Local reporters, alerted that this might be the man suspected of killing a reputed mob boss on Staten Island, raised their cameras. When the judge called the case, Comello did something unexpected. Instead of keeping his hands folded or resting them on the table, he raised his right hand, palm outward, toward the gallery and the press. Drawn in heavy ink across his skin were a letter and several slogans. On the center of his palm, stark and unmistakable, was a large Q around it, and along his fingers were phrases and symbols associated with fervent support for President Trump and the QAnon movement. MAGA forever, United we stand. PATRIOTS in charge. To those familiar with the iconography of online conspiracy communities, the message was obvious. To everyone else in the room, Including the judge, it was disorienting. The courtroom fell into a brief, puzzled silence. The judge, focused on the extradition paperwork, asked routine questions. Did he understand the nature of the hearing? Did he have a lawyer? Would he waive his right to fight being returned to New York? At one point, Comello appeared to try to speak at length, prompting his court-appointed attorney to place a hand on his arm and quietly advise him to remain silent, reminding him that anything he said could be used against him later. He nodded, but kept his palm turned outward, as if determined to ensure that the scribbled words were captured by as many lenses as possible. Within hours, images of that raised hand were on television screens and news websites across the country. Headlines that had initially framed the case as a possible mafia power struggle now competed with a different narrative. The accused shooter of a Gambino boss had displayed the letter Q in court, apparently aligning himself with an internet-fueled conspiracy theory that believed a secret war was underway inside the U.S. government. The collision between those two worlds, traditional organized crime and online extremism, fascinated and alarmed observers. For the QAnon community itself, the photograph was instantly recognizable. The Q was their central symbol, derived from the anonymous poster who claimed to hold top-level security clearance. MAGA Forever echoed the campaign slogan that had first energized many of the movement's adherents. United We Stand and Patriots in Charge reflected QAnon's core story, that a hidden group of patriots close to the president was quietly dismantling a corrupt deep state, and that ordinary believers could assist by spreading the message and, in some cases, taking action. Commentators who had been tracking QAnon for months pointed to the courtroom display as a chilling sign that the movement's more extreme strains were not confined to message boards. Until then, many officials had viewed QAnon as an odd but mostly online phenomenon, noisy, disruptive, and built on baseless claims, but not obviously linked to serious crimes. Now a young man accused of a high-profile killing was literally wearing its symbols into court. The question was how directly those beliefs had influenced his alleged actions. From a legal standpoint, the New Jersey hearing remained narrowly focused. Through his attorney, Comello waived extradition, agreeing to be transferred back to New York to face the murder and weapons charges being prepared by Staten Island prosecutors. The judge ordered him held, and arrangements were made for his return under guard. There was no extended argument over bail at that stage. The expectation was that such issues would be addressed once he appeared before a New York court. When he was transported back across state lines and brought to the Staten Island courthouse in St. George, the atmosphere was far more intense. This was the borough where both he and Cali had lived, where the killing had occurred, and where local law enforcement and the district attorney's office bore the responsibility of prosecuting the case. Security was heavy. Members of the press lined the corridors, and television trucks idled outside, their satellite dishes angled toward the gray spring sky. In his first New York appearance, prosecutors formally charged him with second-degree murder and 2 counts of criminal possession of a weapon. The indictment that followed would lay out the state's theory in straightforward terms. That on March 13, 2019, with intent to cause the death of another person, he had shot and killed Francesco Cali, and that he had illegally possessed the firearm used in the crime. Under New York law, those charges carried the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence, potentially life behind bars, if he were convicted. He entered a plea of not guilty. On the question of bail, the outcome was effectively preordained. Given the seriousness of the charges, the deliberate killing of a man whom authorities identified as the head of an organized crime family, prosecutors argued that he posed a significant flight risk and a danger to the community. The judge agreed. Comello was ordered held without bail, remanded to custody pending trial. As the legal machinery began to turn, attention turned to his background and to the motives that might have propelled him to the driveway on Hilltop Terrace that night. The Staten Island District Attorney's Office, in its early public statements, avoided detailed speculation. Officials emphasized the strength of the physical and digital evidence, the surveillance footage, the tracking of the pickup truck, the phone records, and underscored that they believed the killing was not part of an internal Gambino war. Beyond that, they said, the motive would eventually be addressed in court. Outside the courthouse, and in the pages of newspapers, a more expansive narrative was forming. Reporters dug into Comello's social media history, his odd prior attempts to arrest public figures, and his apparent immersion in conspiracy-laden content. National outlets interviewed experts on extremist movements and digital radicalization, asking how a young man from a relatively ordinary Staten Island background might have come to view himself as some kind of self-appointed enforcer in a battle against shadowy enemies. His defense attorney, Robert Gottlieb, a veteran New York criminal lawyer, quickly signaled that the case would not be litigated as a simple whodunit. In comments to the press, as well as in formal court filings, Gottlieb described a client whose grasp on reality had broken under the strain of online propaganda and psychological instability. He emphasized that there was no credible evidence that organized crime had hired or directed Comello. Instead, Gottlieb suggested, his client had acted out of a delusional belief that he was authorized to capture or neutralize individuals he saw as threats to the country. According to the defense's early outline, Comello had become convinced that various government officials, judges, and other prominent figures were members of a corrupt deep state, aligned against President Trump and against the nation itself. Within that framework, somewhere along the line, he came to see Cali, a man already labeled dangerous in law enforcement files, but for reasons unrelated to politics. As part of the same supposed network, the defense asserted that, in his mind, this justified a so-called citizen's arrest. This framing served dual purposes. Legally, it foreshadowed a defense based on mental disease or defect, an argument that, because of serious mental illness, he could not fully understand the nature or wrongfulness of his actions. In the court of public opinion, it also placed responsibility, in part, on the influence of online conspiracy theories that had spread with little friction across social platforms. Prosecutors responded cautiously but firmly. Whatever his beliefs, they argued, the evidence showed deliberate, voluntary conduct, the drive to a specific address, the staged accident to lure the victim from his home, the use of a firearm at close range, and the flight from the scene. In their telling, even if his motives were unusual, the planning and execution fit the legal definition of intentional homicide. Mental illness, they acknowledged, might be relevant to questions of responsibility and punishment, but it did not erase the fact that a man had lost his life in a calculated act. Even as these competing narratives took shape, another set of legal questions emerged. Was Comello mentally competent to stand trial at all? Under U.S. law, a defendant must be able to understand the nature of the proceedings and assist in their own defense. If a judge has reason to doubt that capacity, the court can order a psychiatric evaluation and, if necessary, treatment before the case proceeds. The courtroom behavior that had stunned observers, the inked hand, the apparent eagerness to make symbolic statements rather than focus on the immediate legal peril, reinforced defense claims that something was profoundly amiss. Gottlieb requested, and prosecutors did not oppose, a full psychological assessment. The judge granted the motion, ordering that mental health professionals examine the defendant and report back on his fitness to participate in the proceedings. Over the months that followed, those evaluations painted a troubling picture. While the detailed reports were largely sealed to protect medical privacy, summaries referenced in later hearings and media accounts indicated that examiners found strong evidence of psychotic symptoms, fixed, false beliefs resistant to reason, and a worldview deeply colored by conspiracy narratives. He reportedly maintained that he had been guided or authorized by higher authorities, including figures he believed to be connected to the president, and that his actions had been part of a mission to protect the country. These findings brought the case into alignment with a broader concern that had begun to surface among law enforcement and intelligence agencies: the potential for conspiracy theories like QAnon to contribute to real-world violence. In 2019, a bulletin from an FBI field office, later reported by the media, explicitly warned that conspiracy theory-driven domestic extremists, including some adherents of QAnon, might pose a threat. The analysis cited online rhetoric and several past incidents in which individuals acting under the influence of fringe beliefs had engaged in armed standoffs or other criminal acts. For Staten Island prosecutors, however, the task remained immediate and concrete: prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the man they had in custody had killed Cali. To do that, they assembled a case rooted in physical and electronic evidence. Surveillance footage was synchronized with phone and license plate data. Forensic analysts matched shell casings to the recovered weapon. Witnesses who had seen the pickup truck before or after the shooting were interviewed and prepared for potential testimony. At the same time, another ritual of the old underworld played out. In late March 2019, hundreds of mourners attended Cali's funeral at a church on Staten Island. Plainclothes detectives and federal agents watched discreetly from a distance, noting who approached, who embraced whom, which out-of-town license plates appeared on nearby streets. The service itself was solemn. There were no public outbursts of anger or vows of retribution. If there were discussions within the Gambino family about the meaning of the killing and the possibility of a response, they did not spill into open warfare. This relative quiet underscored the degree to which the case stood apart from the stereotypical imagery of mob vengeance. Instead of triggering a cascade of retaliatory shootings, it seemed to solidify a cautious recognition, even among underworld figures, that something unusual had happened, something not easily filed under the familiar category of business. Many in that world, like the public at large, came to accept the emerging explanation that the boss had been killed not by a rival seeking power, but by a young man adrift in a sea of delusion. Inside Rikers Island, where he was initially held, and later in more secure mental health settings, Comello's daily existence shrank to the routines of confinement and evaluation. Visits with family were limited and monitored. His interactions with his attorney became a crucial window into his state of mind. Gottlieb later described conversations in which the defendant moved rapidly from mundane topics to elaborate, conspiratorial narratives, insisting that he remained part of a larger struggle. For the defense team, this made the prospect of a conventional trial, with its reliance on clear recollections, rational strategy, and controlled testimony, increasingly remote. Hearings in Staten Island Supreme Court stretched across 2019 and into 2020, punctuated by motions and status conferences rather than dramatic confrontations. The QAnon connection, while still a point of public fascination, became just one element in a larger legal drama centered on mental competency. Psychiatrists testified or submitted affidavits. Prosecutors pressed for updates, emphasizing the community's interest in a timely resolution. The defense urged patience, arguing that their client's condition required careful management and that rushing to trial would violate fundamental principles of fairness. By mid-2020, after multiple examinations, a judge formally found that Comello was not competent to stand trial. Under New York law, that did not end the case. Instead, it triggered a different process. He was ordered transferred to a secure psychiatric facility run by the State Office of Mental Health, where doctors would attempt to restore his capacity to understand the proceedings and assist in his own defense. Only if and when they deemed him restored could the criminal case move forward. This ruling marked a turning point. The trial that many had expected, a high-profile courtroom battle that would parse the influence of QAnon, debate the boundaries of personal responsibility in the age of online radicalization, and perhaps force witnesses from law enforcement and digital platforms to testify, was postponed indefinitely. Instead, the story shifted to the quieter, less visible realm of psychiatric treatment and periodic legal check-ins. For the families involved, the change carried different weights. Cali's relatives and associates, who had already buried their dead, now faced the prospect of years passing without a traditional verdict. There would be no immediate jury finding of guilt or innocence, no sentencing hearing at which they could address the court. Justice, as the system defined it, had entered a holding pattern, conditioned on the internal progress of the man who had taken their loved one's life. For Comello's own family, the ruling seemed to confirm what they had come to fear, that the son and brother they knew had been overtaken by an illness they did not fully understand, and that the internet-fueled worldview that had captivated him was not just misguided but symptomatic of a deeper break from reality. Visits now took place in the austere environment of a psychiatric security ward, under the watchful eyes of both medical staff and corrections officers. Outside those institutional walls, the world moved on. The burst of national attention that had followed the ornate headlines, "Mob boss gunned down," "QAnon suspect arrested," faded as other stories rose to prominence. Yet in the background, the case remained a reference point in conversations about the risks of conspiratorial thinking, the capacity of social media to amplify and legitimize fringe beliefs, and the challenges the criminal justice system faces when ideology and mental illness intertwine. On Staten Island, the brick house on Hilltop Terrace eventually receded back into a more ordinary form of anonymity, its cameras still watching but its occupant gone. The street returned to the rhythms of quiet evenings, passing traffic, and the distant sound of the city. And in court calendars and hospital records, the name Anthony Comello persisted as an open file, a reminder that, beneath the headlines, the resolution of a crime can stretch over years, shaped as much by the mental state of the accused as by the facts established in the moments a gun is fired. In the secure corridors of the state psychiatric system, the man whose name had once been shouted in tabloid headlines became, in bureaucratic terms, a 730 defendant, the shorthand New York courts use for someone found unfit to stand trial under Article 730 of the Criminal Procedure Law. When criminal charges are serious, as in his case, that label almost always leads to one destination: a locked forensic hospital, run not by corrections officers but by psychiatrists under contract with the state. From the outside, such facilities look more like institutional campuses than prisons. Low brick buildings, high fences, carefully monitored entrances. Inside, however, the security is strict. Patients are searched, movement is controlled, and contact with the outside world is heavily regulated. For Anthony Comello, the transfer from Rikers Island to a state psychiatric unit in 2020 changed the setting of his confinement but not the essential fact of it. Doors still locked behind him. His life was still governed by schedules he did not control. The difference lay in the purpose. The law now defined his stay not as punishment or pretrial detention, but as treatment aimed at restoring his ability to participate in his own prosecution. The ruling that sent him there rested on a clear legal standard. Competency to stand trial is not a measure of moral blameworthiness. It asks two narrower questions. Does the defendant understand the nature of the proceedings against them? And can they meaningfully assist their lawyer in mounting a defense? If the answer to either is no, because of mental illness or intellectual disability, the Constitution requires that the criminal case pause. The state cannot haul someone into court, seat a jury, and proceed with a trial if that person cannot grasp who the players are or what is at stake. Psychiatrists who evaluated Comello in the months after his arrest told the court that he failed that test. Public descriptions of their findings, summarized in motions and in limited reporting, indicated that they found entrenched delusions. He reportedly insisted that he remained part of a larger patriotic mission, that forces aligned with the president had authorized his actions, and that he was under extraordinary forms of surveillance or control. These beliefs did not vanish when confronted with contrary evidence. They were, in clinical terms, fixed. The judge accepted the expert's conclusion. At that point, he was not capable of rationally understanding the basic structure of the case against him. Under Article 730, that determination triggered an automatic regime. The murder indictment did not disappear. The charges were not dropped. Instead, they were placed in a kind of legal suspension. The State Office of Mental Health took custody of the defendant, and the clock began to run on a different kind of timeline, one measured not in months to trial but in periodic psychiatric reports. Doctors were required to evaluate him regularly and tell the court whether, in their professional judgment, he remained unfit or had improved enough for the case to resume. For prosecutors in Staten Island, the shift was frustrating but familiar. In homicide cases, incompetency findings are relatively rare, but not unheard of. The district attorney's office publicly reiterated its position. If and when he was restored to competency, they intended to bring him to trial on the original charges. The community, they argued, was owed a full accounting of what had happened on Hilltop Terrace that night, and a formal determination of criminal responsibility. For the defense, the ruling was both a relief and a sobering confirmation. Avoiding an immediate trial meant their client would not be thrust into an adversarial process for which, in their view, he was plainly unprepared. At the same time, transfer to a forensic hospital signaled that his problems were not merely strategic or rhetorical. The state's own experts had now agreed on the record that he was mentally ill to a degree that disabled him from managing his case. From that point forward, the defense strategy would unfold on two intertwined tracks: monitoring his clinical condition and preserving legal arguments about his culpability in the event that competency was ever restored. Daily life in such hospitals is shielded from public scrutiny, and there is little in the public record about the details of Comello's routine there. New York law protects medical privacy, even for those facing serious criminal charges, but the broad contours of the experience are known from other cases. Patients attend structured therapy sessions, meet with psychiatrists, participate in monitored activities, and take prescribed medications if they consent or if a court has authorized treatment over their objections. The goal, at least in the justice system's design, is not simply to warehouse but to stabilize. The legal stakes of that stabilization are significant. If, after a period of treatment, doctors report that a defendant now understands the roles of judge, prosecutor, and defense counsel, can follow the sequence of a trial, and can talk coherently with their attorney about strategy, the court can declare competence restored. The criminal case then resumes, often with renewed debates over insanity defenses or diminished responsibility. If, on the other hand, a defendant remains persistently incompetent for a period roughly equal to the maximum sentence they could face if convicted, the law requires the state to reconsider its options. Sometimes that leads to civil commitment in a non-criminal psychiatric setting, sometimes to supervised release. In a murder case, the pressures weigh heavily toward continued confinement in some form. As the months passed and then turned into years, the Comello case moved into a quieter but no less consequential phase. On court calendars, it appeared for periodic status conferences. Judges asked for updated reports from the hospital. Prosecutors in Staten Island reassured journalists who inquired that the case was still active, that the intention to prosecute had not changed. But there were no jury selections, no opening statements, no parade of witnesses. The most notorious Staten Island homicide in recent memory had entered a kind of legal limbo. Outside the courtroom, however, the broader currents that had shaped his path continued to churn. The QAnon movement, whose symbols he had scrawled on his hand in that New Jersey courtroom, did not fade after his arrest. Through 2019 and into 2020, it expanded, fueled by algorithmic recommendation systems, partisan media, and a constant stream of new drops, From the anonymous figure calling himself Q followers wove new narratives around every major event, from diplomatic summits to celebrity scandals, always returning to the core claim that a hidden cabal of powerful wrongdoers was about to be exposed. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in early 2020, straining public health systems and throwing economies into disarray, conspiracy theories in general proliferated. QAnon adherents folded the virus into their worldview, suggesting that it was either exaggerated by the deep state to hurt the president or, conversely, part of a bioweapon plot by hidden enemies. As lockdowns kept millions at home, online engagement surged. Researchers who study extremist movements later noted a marked uptick in Q-related content and recruitment during those months. In that context, the case of a young man already accused of killing under the banner of QAnon took on renewed significance for law enforcement and analysts. Training materials for some agencies began to include his name alongside a handful of other incidents in which individuals influenced by conspiracy theories had resorted to violence or attempted violence. The point in those briefings was not to suggest that belief in any particular narrative was by itself determinative, but to illustrate how, in vulnerable individuals, such ideas could intertwine with mental instability in dangerous ways. Journalists returned to the story periodically, especially around anniversaries of the shooting or in the wake of other Q-related incidents. Long-form articles in national outlets revisited the odd intersection of traditional organized crime and internet-born extremism, using his case as a vivid example. Reporters recounted his quiet Staten Island upbringing, the night on Hilltop Terrace, the arrest in New Jersey, the Q-marked hand in court, and the eventual finding of incompetency. They noted, often in somber tones, that he now resided in a mental institution, his fate undecided. For the family of Francesco Cali, those periodic stories served as painful reminders that the legal chapter remained unfinished. Their loss was not hypothetical or symbolic. A husband and father had been killed in front of his home. Children had watched the emergency vehicles arrive. A funeral had been held. Yet the official system had not yet produced the form of closure that homicide victims' relatives are taught to expect. A trial, a verdict, a sentence pronounced from the bench. Interviews with people close to the family, when they spoke at all, conveyed a mix of resignation and patience. Whatever they thought of the defendant's mental state, they were left waiting. On Staten Island itself, public discussion of the case gradually cooled. In the immediate aftermath, it had dominated local conversation. A reputed mob boss killed in a wealthy neighborhood, a young islander arrested, rumors flying about possible retaliation. As time went on, new concerns absorbed residents' attention. The pandemic's impact on schools and small businesses, changing patterns of crime and policing, the politics of mask mandates and vaccine campaigns. The memory of the shooting remained, but it no longer set the daily tempo of talk radio or neighborhood speculation. Within his own family, by contrast, the case remained a constant presence. Relatives traveled to see him at the hospital when allowed, navigating background checks, metal detectors, and strict time limits. They were drawn into the technical world of psychiatric legal procedure, competency hearings, clinicians' reports, and the opaque terminology of diagnoses. In public statements channeled through the defense, they emphasized that he had not grown up in a violent environment or as part of any criminal network, and that the person they now visited bore little resemblance to the son or brother they remembered from earlier years. The convergence of ideological extremism and apparent psychosis in his case posed difficult questions not just for lawyers and doctors, but for society more broadly. When is a person simply choosing to embrace a fringe political theory, however baseless, and when is that embrace a symptom of an underlying illness? At what point does the law treat delusional beliefs as evidence of insanity? And when does it treat them as dangerous but voluntary commitments for which someone can be fully punished? Forensic psychiatrists who spoke in general terms to the press not about his private file, but about the issues his case raised, underscored a knotty reality. Delusions in the clinical sense are not just unusual ideas. They are beliefs held with unshakable conviction, impervious to contrary evidence, and often idiosyncratic. But what happens when a belief that looks delusional is in fact shared by thousands of people on message boards and in rallies? The spread of QAnon complicated that boundary. A patient who insisted that an invisible cabal of elites was trafficking in secret crimes might be echoing a widely disseminated internet narrative rather than inventing a solitary fantasy. Legally, the distinction still hinged on functionality. If a defendant's adherence to such ideas was so intense that it rendered them unable to understand the wrongfulness of their actions, an insanity defense might be available at trial. If, however, they understood on some level that society condemned their conduct, hiding evidence, fleeing, attempting to avoid identification, courts tended to treat them as criminally responsible, whatever strange theories they espoused. In Comello's case, that debate remained hypothetical because the threshold question of competency had not yet been resolved in his favor. Meanwhile, the political landscape that had nourished QAnon shifted dramatically. The 2020 election, its disputed aftermath, and the January 6, 2021 assault on the U.S. Capitol brought the movement's potential for real-world disruption into stark relief. Some Q-aligned slogans and symbols appeared in the crowd that stormed the building. In the weeks that followed, major social media platforms undertook a belated crackdown, banning prominent Q-affiliated accounts and purging groups that had served as organizing hubs. As Q's original posting channels went dark and its messaging ecosystem fractured, some commentators predicted that the movement would evaporate. Others warned that it would simply mutate, seeping into broader streams of political rhetoric. For those who study radicalization, the lesson from cases like Comello was less about the specific content of any one conspiracy theory and more about the structural vulnerabilities that allowed such narratives to thrive. Algorithmic amplification, the difficulty of moderating encrypted or anonymous spaces, and the social isolation that made some individuals especially susceptible. In intermittent court hearings, some held remotely as the pandemic forced the justice system to adapt, judges on Staten Island continue to ask the same narrow questions. Had anything changed in the reports from the hospital? Was the defendant any closer to being able to answer basic queries about the roles of courtroom participants and the stakes of his case? The answers, at least in the portions that reached the public, suggested that progress was slow at best. Retention orders were renewed. Treatment continued. The murder indictment stayed on the books. By the early 2020s, the gap between the drama of the initial crime and the subdued, technical reality of its aftermath had grown wide. For many members of the public who had first encountered his name in screaming headlines, the story felt unresolved but distant, replaced in their attention by newer crises. For legal and mental health professionals, however, the case remained a touchstone, an example cited in continuing debates about how the system should handle defendants whose violence is intertwined with conspiratorial belief. In the sterile language of court filings and psychiatric summaries, the contours of his fate remained remarkably unchanged. He was the accused killer of a reputed organized crime leader, found incompetent to stand trial, housed in a secure state hospital, his prospects contingent on shifts in a mind that had once found marching orders in the flicker of online messages. What would happen if that mind cleared? Or if it never did, hung as an unanswered question over one of the most unusual homicide cases New York had seen in a generation. Month after month, that unanswered question, what would happen if his mind cleared, or if it never did, sat at the center of the docket entry bearing Anthony Comello's name. Each time the case returned to a Staten Island courtroom, it did so in the restrained language of status conferences, orders for updated psychiatric reports, acknowledgments that he remained in state custody, notations that the indictment was still pending. The drama that had once swirled around him, the sirens on Hilltop Terrace, the manhunt to New Jersey, the raised queue in a crowded courtroom, had given way to a quieter, slower process governed by clinical charts and statutory timelines. Under New York law, once a defendant is found incompetent, the responsibility for their daily care shifts decisively to the Office of Mental Health. For a serious felony like murder, the defendant is typically sent to one of the state's secure forensic psychiatric centers, institutions designed to handle patients who are both severely ill and under criminal indictment. There, the rhythms of life are dictated less by legal argument than by medication schedules, therapy rotations, and the routines of locked wards. The aim is restoration, to stabilize thinking, diminish delusional intensity, and bring the patient to a point where they can at least understand the roles of judge, prosecutor, and defense counsel, and weigh advice about plea offers or trial strategy. From the perspective of the court, progress in that environment is measured in the prose of reports filed every 6 or 12 months. Psychiatrists summarize their observations. Has the patient's orientation improved? Does he now understand that he is charged with murder? Can he accurately describe the function of a jury? When asked why he is being held, does he answer in concrete terms linked to his actual actions? Or does he veer immediately into talk of secret missions and shadowy enemies? Judges, who must ultimately decide whether competency has been restored, read these documents alongside the legal file that still describes, in stark allegations, the events of March 13, 2019. For much of the period after his transfer, those reports, as described in open court, told a consistent story. Publicly available accounts indicate that clinicians continued to find significant impairment. He remained preoccupied with themes that had dominated his thinking at the time of the killing: hidden cabals, patriotic mandates, and a conviction that he had acted as an instrument of a larger, righteous plan. These beliefs, the doctors suggested, were not merely political opinions, however extreme, but part of a more pervasive break with shared reality. On that basis, judges repeatedly extended his commitment, finding that he remained unfit to stand trial. Outside the legal and medical systems, his name surfaced intermittently in another context, as a case study in the emerging literature on conspiracy-fueled violence. Think tank reports, academic articles, and long-form journalism pieces that sought to trace the real-world impact of QAnon and similar movements often devoted a section to his story. They recounted his immersion in online forums, his failed citizen's arrest, attempts at government sites, his display of Q-related slogans in court, and the ultimate finding that he was mentally incompetent. His trajectory, these analyses argued, illustrated how an already vulnerable individual could be drawn to the brink by a digital ecosystem that normalized and celebrated extreme views. In those accounts, his case was rarely treated in isolation. Writers and researchers placed it alongside other incidents from the same period. The man who drove to a Washington, D.C. pizzeria in 2016, armed with a rifle, convinced by an earlier conspiracy theory that children were being harmed in its basement. The Nevada man arrested near the Hoover Dam in 2018 after blocking a bridge in a truck, while demanding the release of a government report he believed would validate QAnon claims. The small but troubling cluster of other arrests in which suspects echoed, in their social media or statements, the slogans and assumptions of Q's narrative. In that gallery of examples, Comello's act stood out for the profile of his victim, a reputed mafia leader, and for the sheer implausibility, to most observers, of linking that world with the online fantasies of a fringe political subculture. Law enforcement agencies, too, incorporated these lessons into their internal analyses. A 2019 bulletin from an FBI field office, made public by reporters later that year, explicitly labeled conspiracy theory-driven domestic extremists as a potential terrorism concern. It cited QAnon as one of several belief systems that, though lacking centralized leadership or coherent organization, could inspire adherents to commit crimes in the name of self-devised missions. The document did not mention him by name, but in interviews and off-the-record briefings, officials acknowledged that his case had helped crystallize the risks for investigators who might otherwise have dismissed online rhetoric as mere noise. Even as these broader discussions took shape, the more traditional world of organized crime was adjusting to the vacuum left by the death on Hilltop Terrace. The Gambino family, once the most flamboyantly visible of New York's 5 families, had already adopted a lower profile in the years before 2019. Gone were the daily press conferences on courthouse steps, the gaudy tailor-made suits, the swaggering interviews with tabloid columnists. Federal racketeering prosecutions had driven many of the most brazen bosses into prison, and the survivors learned hard lessons from those collapses. Law enforcement sources believed that, after Cali's death, the family's hierarchy quietly reconstituted itself, with existing captains and advisors stepping into leadership roles. If there were internal disputes about succession, they did not spill into open violence of the kind that had once made the front page. In that sense, his act, as far as the evidence has publicly indicated, landed like a destabilizing shock from outside the system rather than a move on its internal chessboard. There is no credible indication that he gained status, money, or underworld allies from the killing. Instead, he left behind a risk for the organization he had struck: heightened scrutiny from law enforcement, renewed headlines about mafia violence, and a reminder that even a group known for its control could be blindsided by the actions of a stranger with no apparent ties to its code. If Gambino leaders discussed retaliation outside their own circles, those conversations never surfaced in public. The suspect was already in custody within days, leaving them little to avenge, and the fact that he ended up in a psychiatric facility further softened whatever impulse for underworld justice might have existed. Meanwhile, the Staten Island District Attorney's office faced the challenge of keeping a complex homicide case viable over a span of years without a trial. Evidence that is clear in the immediate aftermath of a crime can become harder to present effectively as time passes. Witnesses move, memories fade, digital records can become more difficult to access as technology platforms change. Prosecutors took steps to preserve what they could, securing the surveillance footage in multiple formats, maintaining copies of key phone and internet records, and staying in contact with law enforcement officers who had handled the initial investigation in case they were later needed to testify. They also had to manage expectations. Each time the case returned to court solely to extend his psychiatric commitment, reporters would ask whether a trial was still on the horizon. Publicly, the DA's office repeated its position. The charges remained in force, and if competency was ever restored, they fully intended to prosecute the murder. Privately, they knew that homicide prosecutions that hinge on long-delayed trials are difficult, though not impossible, to win. Jurors are asked to focus on a narrative that unfolded years earlier, and the defense can argue that the passage of time has unfairly eroded the defendant's ability to contest the state's evidence. Those are familiar tactical battles in older cold cases. Here, they were anticipated in a case that had been high profile from the start. For the defense team, the long period in the forensic hospital created a different set of calculations. If at some point doctors reported that his condition had improved enough to make him trial competent, they would have to decide how to structure their arguments. One obvious path would be to pursue an insanity defense, asserting that at the time of the killing he was so impaired by mental disease or defect that he could not understand the nature or wrongfulness of his actions. In New York, that is a narrow and difficult standard to meet. The burden would be on the defense to prove his insanity by a preponderance of the evidence, typically through expert testimony and detailed psychiatric histories. Evidence that he had spent months in a state facility deemed incompetent might support that claim, but it would not settle it. Competency to stand trial and criminal responsibility at the time of the offense are related but distinct legal questions. A defendant can be sane at the time of a crime yet later deteriorate, or, conversely, have been in the grip of severe psychosis during the act but respond well to treatment afterward. Prosecutors could point to signs of planning, the decision to bring a weapon, the use of a staged car accident to draw Cali from his home, the flight from the scene, as evidence that, whatever his beliefs, he understood the practical consequences of his conduct and took steps to avoid capture. Another possible approach would be to negotiate some form of plea agreement if and when competence returned, perhaps to a lesser homicide charge that acknowledged his impairment without fully exonerating him. Such negotiations, if they occurred, have not been publicly detailed. Plea talks in cases involving serious violence and mental illness are delicate. Families of victims sometimes resist any resolution that does not include the maximum statutory penalties. Prosecutors are wary of creating precedents that might appear to excuse ideologically tinged violence, and defense lawyers must weigh their clients' best interests against the unpredictable dynamics of a jury trial that would inevitably draw intense media attention. In all of these scenarios, a practical constraint loomed: his own ability to participate in decision-making. Even if doctors concluded at some point that he was marginally competent in the narrow legal sense, defense counsel would have to assess whether he could meaningfully evaluate options. Would he agree, for example, to consider a plea that required acknowledging wrongful conduct? Or would his internal narrative compel him to insist that he had acted under valid authority and could not accept any guilt? The same conspiratorial mindset that had led him into legal jeopardy might, paradoxically, make it harder to extricate him through the ordinary tools of negotiation. Beyond the courtroom and hospital, the ripple effects of his case continued in more subtle ways. On Staten Island, neighborhood discussions about mental health infrastructure took on renewed urgency as the pandemic aggravated existing strains. Residents and local officials debated the availability of psychiatric services, the difficulty of getting troubled young adults evaluated before a crisis, and the challenges families face when a relative begins to embrace extreme views but has not yet committed a chargeable offense. In those conversations, his story functioned less as a singular anomaly and more as a warning about what can happen when warning signs are missed or discounted. At the national level, policymakers struggled with a related but broader dilemma: how to address the role of social media platforms in amplifying fringe narratives without overstepping constitutional protections. The companies that hosted much of the content that had fascinated him, message boards, video platforms, microblogging sites, were pressed by lawmakers to explain their moderation policies. Some responded by removing QAnon-related groups, banning prominent accounts, and downgrading the spread of obviously conspiratorial posts. Others moved more cautiously, wary of being seen as arbiters of truth in a polarized environment. Critics of these moderation efforts argued that the platforming could drive adherents into more secretive channels, making it harder to monitor genuinely dangerous behavior. Supporters countered that keeping such material in the algorithmic mainstream risked normalizing it and recruiting the vulnerable. In debates on these questions, his case was occasionally mentioned as an example of what can go wrong when a person who already shows signs of psychological instability finds endless reinforcement for their most extreme ideas online. Through it all, the core facts of his own situation remained stubbornly unchanged. As of the most recent public reporting before this documentary was compiled, court records and news accounts indicated that he was still confined in a secure psychiatric facility, still facing the same Staten Island indictment, still periodically examined by doctors whose evaluations would determine whether he might ever be tried. No jury had heard the full array of evidence about what happened on Hilltop Terrace. No verdict had been reached, no sentence had been pronounced. The human dimensions of that stasis were felt most acutely by the families on either side. For the Calis, Time's passage brought graduations, holidays, and ordinary milestones marked in the absence of a husband and father whose life had been entwined not only with his immediate household, but with a wider circle of relatives and associates. For the Comellos, aging parents now navigated middle and later life, knowing that their son's name was permanently attached to a crime they had neither sanctioned nor foreseen, and that their contact with him would likely be limited to supervised visits in institutional settings. For historians and observers trying to make sense of Anthony Comello's life, this long limbo complicates narrative closure. Unlike many crime stories, there is no definitive endpoint in the form of a trial transcript and a sentencing memo that neatly summarizes the state's conclusions about motive and responsibility. Instead, his path remains open-ended, reflecting the intersection of three forces that resist simple resolution: the slow processes of mental health treatment, the rigid structures of criminal law, and the fast-moving, ever-changing world of online belief that first helped draw him into the spotlight. As the years after the shooting accumulated, the outlines of Anthony Comello's case settled into a paradoxical shape, at once indelibly public and stubbornly unresolved. The core facts had been splashed across headlines in 2019. Anyone who had followed New York news closely that spring could recite the rough sequence. A reputed Gambino crime boss gunned down in front of his Staten Island home. A 24-year-old construction worker arrested days later. The defendant raising a hand marked with QAnon slogans in court. And eventually, psychiatrists declaring him unfit to stand trial. Beyond that, though, the story did not progress along the familiar arc of American true crime. No dramatic jury selection, no contested verdict, no closing arguments dissected on cable panels. Instead, it plateaued in the liminal space of pending but paused, a space defined by medical evaluations more than legal maneuvers. In journalistic retrospectives that appeared on anniversaries of the killing, or in broader pieces about organized crime's evolution, the case was often revisited as a kind of hinge between eras. On one side stood the long history of New York's mafia families, a saga of clandestine meetings, internal betrayals, wiretaps, and RICO indictments. On the other side lay the newer world of online radicalization, anonymous message boards, and sprawling conspiracy narratives. The driveway on Hilltop Terrace, where those two histories had intersected so violently, became a symbolic location in these accounts, a quiet cul-de-sac where an old underworld tradition had been pierced by the unpredictable energies of the internet age. Reporters who retraced the steps of the investigation found that law enforcement officials, speaking on background, still regarded the case as one of the strangest they had encountered. Detectives who had built careers on dismantling gambling rings and extortion rackets were accustomed to homicides rooted in disputes over money, territory, or power. Here, by contrast, the emerging picture, based on digital forensics, interviews, and court-ordered psychiatric assessments, pointed not to a rivalry between crews, but to an individual whose sense of reality had been profoundly warped. Some officers described their own initial disbelief when, after the arrest, they started to uncover his attempts at citizens' arrests, and his fixation on slogans and concepts lifted from QAnon circles. It was, as one retired organized crime investigator told a national newspaper, like the past and the future collided in the worst possible way. Media coverage in the immediate aftermath of the shooting had largely treated Cali as the central figure. His mugshot from a prior arrest, his reputed position atop the Gambino hierarchy, his Sicilian heritage and low-key style, all of these details fit neatly into well-established narratives about the mafia's enduring if diminished presence in New York. As time passed, however, and the lack of a conventional trial shifted attention away from courtroom drama, the lens widened. Long-form features began to devote more space to Comello's path. His Staten Island upbringing, his lack of known ties to organized crime, his immersion in online conspiracies, the visible signs of psychological decline that relatives and his lawyer later described. These pieces often drew on interviews with mental health experts and scholars of extremism rather than with mob historians. Commentators analyzed his case alongside other incidents involving individuals who appeared to straddle the line between ideological radicalization and mental illness. They wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. To what extent can someone in the grip of fixed delusions truly choose to commit an act of violence? How should courts balance society's need for accountability with the obligation to recognize genuine incapacity? And how do you even define delusion when the belief in question, in a hidden cabal or a deep state, is shared by large online communities and echoed by some public figures? In these discussions, his reputation took on a particular cast. He was not remembered as a calculating underworld hitter or as a political assassin acting on a coherent manifesto. Instead, he was cited as a cautionary figure, a young man who, by all available evidence, had never been absorbed into the disciplined structures of La Cosa Nostra or the organized extremist groups that law enforcement traditionally monitors, but who nonetheless posed a lethal threat because of the toxic combination of his own mental vulnerabilities and the narrative scaffolding provided by conspiratorial subcultures. In academic articles and policy papers, his name appeared in footnotes and case lists under headings like lone actor violence, ideologically motivated but disorganized offenders, and conspiracy theory, influenced criminality. That analytical framing stood in stark contrast to the imagery that had originally dominated coverage of the crime. The word mob, in block letters over grainy photos of Hilltop Terrace, comparisons to the 1985 assassination of Paul Castellano, speculation about internecine Gambino politics. Francesco Cali's own story, when told in depth, revealed a man whose life had been shaped by a very different set of structures than those that molded his killer. Born into an Italian immigrant milieu and coming of age in Brooklyn neighborhoods where the mob's presence was tangible, he had followed a path well documented in law enforcement files. From minor involvement in family businesses to alleged membership in a crew, from there to a more central role in what authorities viewed as the family's leadership. Cali's ascent coincided with a period of sustained pressure on the American mafia. Starting in the 1980s, federal prosecutors had used racketeering statutes to bring sweeping cases against the Commission, the governing council of New York's 5 families, and against individual bosses like John Gotti. Waves of convictions sent many high-ranking figures to long prison terms. By the time Cali was described by investigators as an acting boss, the very concept of an acting head reflected the cautious, decentralized strategies adopted in response to those prosecutions. Leaders sought to avoid the flamboyance that had made earlier bosses easy targets. They delegated more responsibilities, kept their business fronts modest, and limited their public exposures. In that context, Cali's reputation among law enforcement was that of a modernized, quieter type of Don, more inclined to businesslike efficiency than theatrical displays. His 2019 murder, committed not in some remote location, but in front of his home with his family inside, broke the pattern that had evolved since the last heyday of mob violence. For investigators steeped in that history, the idea that such a figure could be brought down by a volatile young outsider operating under self-generated motives was deeply unsettling. It suggested a level of unpredictability that neither traditional mob protocols nor routine police surveillance could easily manage. Comello's trajectory, by contrast, mapped onto newer concerns that had been building within federal and local agencies for years, but had only recently come into sharper focus. The threat posed by individuals radicalized primarily through consuming propaganda online rather than through direct recruitment by structured groups. Intelligence bulletins had long warned about lone wolves, acting in the name of extremist ideologies. What set his case apart was the amorphous nature of the belief system that animated him. QAnon was not an organization in any conventional sense. It had no membership rolls, no formal leadership hierarchy, no training camps. Its cohesion came from shared narratives passed around and elaborated in real time by anonymous users scattered across platforms. In interviews, analysts noted that this fluidity made it harder for law enforcement to anticipate specific acts of violence. Traditional investigative techniques, infiltrating groups, mapping leadership structures, monitoring communications between identified members, were less effective against a meme-driven movement where participants continually cycled in and out of forums, and where the line between lurker, true believer, and potential actor was difficult to draw. Comello was, in this view, a troubling example of how someone with minimal in-person ties to extremist circles could still be profoundly influenced by their output. Yet officials also cautioned against drawing overly broad conclusions from one case. The vast majority of people who engaged with QAnon content, they acknowledged, did not commit violent crimes. Many eventually drifted away or compartmentalized those beliefs. To understand why a small subset progressed from keyboard activism to real-world harm required attention to individual psychological profiles as much as to ideological content. Here, his extensive psychiatric record became central. It provided evidence, however redacted in public summaries, of cognitive distortions and emotional instability that predated, or at least developed independently of, any particular conspiracy narrative. Legal commentators watching the case play out in slow motion pointed out that his prolonged confinement highlighted another long-running tension in American criminal justice: the treatment of defendants who are both dangerous and mentally ill. On paper, the system offers clear phases: incompetency commitments, restoration efforts, trials, potential insanity acquittals, and failing that, incarceration. In practice, cases can linger for years at the intersection of these categories, with no clear off-ramp. If a defendant remains incompetent but also appears unlikely to be safely released outside of structured settings, courts and mental health agencies must continually justify continued confinement without the closure of a conviction or acquittal. Civil liberties advocates worry about the potential for such arrangements to become de facto life sentences without the procedural safeguards of a criminal trial. Prosecutors and many members of the public, on the other hand, worry about the risk of releasing someone who has already demonstrated a capacity for serious violence. Comello's situation embodied that dilemma. There was every indication from the evidence gathered in 2019 that he had killed Cali. There was also professional consensus, at least for several years, that he could not rationally participate in adjudicating that fact. As long as both of those things remained true, the status quo, continued hospitalization under court order, persisted. In Staten Island, local perceptions of the case evolved in ways that reflected the borough's own complex identity. Early coverage had tapped into long-standing fascination with the mob's shadowy presence in certain neighborhoods. Tot Hill, with its gated homes and rumors of underworld connections, had long occupied a special place in Staten Island lore. The shock of a killing there, and of that killing being connected to an alleged boss, initially revived that fascination. As the years stretched on, though, and it became clear that there would be no quick, cinematic trial, conversation shifted. Community discussions focused more on mental health resources for youths, on the borough's sometimes tense relationship with the rest of the city, and on the ways national political turbulence filtered down into local conflicts over policing and protest. Those who had known Comello in passing, classmates, neighbors, former coworkers, occasionally shared their impressions with reporters or on social media. Their recollections varied, as memory often does, but a common thread ran through many. Before his deep dive into conspiratorial thinking, he had seemed unremarkable. Some remembered him as quiet, others as more outgoing, but few had seen in him the marks of a budding killer. For them, the transformation described in courtroom filings, from ordinary young adult to man convinced he was on a mission against hidden traitors, was difficult to reconcile with the person they had casually observed. For the family of Francesco Cali, the passage of time layered new absences atop the original loss. Birthdays, holidays, and private commemorations accumulated. Occasionally, when journalists revisited the case, relatives or those close to them would decline to comment, citing ongoing grief and the still pending nature of the legal proceedings. In the rare instances when they spoke even briefly, their words underscored a reality that the legal complexities could not obscure. Whatever the defendant's mental state, a father and husband had been killed on his own property, in front of his home, in a manner that could not be undone by any diagnosis or doctrinal debate. The families on both sides of the case had to navigate a peculiar form of public scrutiny. For the Comellos, every mention of their surname in coverage tied it anew to a notorious crime, regardless of their lack of involvement in the act itself. For the Calis, any public discussion of the victim's alleged position in organized crime brought with it the stigmas and dangers associated with that world. Both families found their private lives intersecting with larger narratives over which they had little control. The decline and persistence of the mafia, the rise of internet-driven extremism, the contested politics of the late 2010s and early 2020s, the perennial struggles of the mental health and criminal justice systems. Against that backdrop, the figure at the center of the story receded from view. There were no new courtroom outbursts, no further symbolic gestures like the inked palm he had displayed in 2019. Behind hospital walls, his world narrowed to treatment plans, clinical interviews, and the regulated monotony of institutional life. Occasional legal filings updated the record, another competency review completed, another finding that he remained unfit, another order extending his commitment. Each notation confirmed that, at least for the time being, the balance struck in 2020 still held. He remained simultaneously an accused murderer and a patient. By the time news accounts in the early 2020s noted that he was still in a state psychiatric facility awaiting possible restoration, QAnon itself had lost some of its centralized coherence. Social media bans, the disappearance of Q's original posting venue, and the fallout from the attack on the U.S. Capitol had scattered the movement's adherents and complicated its recruitment pathways. Yet the broader patterns that had enabled its rise, distrust of institutions, fragmented information ecosystems, algorithm-driven polarization, remained in place. In that sense, the conditions that had once helped shape Comello's beliefs persisted, even as his own ability to engage with the digital world was curtailed by confinement. Looking at his life in full, from an unremarkable Staten Island childhood through a period of escalating conspiratorial obsession, to the fatal encounter on Hilltop Terrace, the swift arrest, the dramatic courtroom gesture, and the long psychiatric interlude, historians and analysts found themselves drawn less to questions of individual villainy than to questions of context. How did a city that had spent decades methodically weakening organized crime come to witness the killing of a reputed boss by a young man radicalized in a fashion that the law's traditional tools struggled to anticipate? How did a culture that prided itself on free expression and open networks manage, or fail to manage, the spread of narratives that could interact unpredictably with individual pathology? In the absence of a final adjudication, those questions formed the frame through which his name was most often invoked. Anthony Comello became, in effect, a case study, not only in legal textbooks or criminology lectures, but in the wider public debate about the challenges of an age where realities could be constructed and reinforced in closed digital loops, and where the consequences of believing too deeply in those constructed worlds could play out far from the screens on which they were first imagined. By the middle of the 2020s, the name Anthony Comello evoked, For those who remembered the headlines of 2019, a strange convergence of worlds. The fatting aura of New York's traditional mafia, the frenetic energy of online conspiracy movements, and the sober machinery of psychiatric and legal institutions dealing with a person they had deemed too unwell to stand trial for a killing no one disputed had taken place. In court files and hospital records, he existed less as a headline figure than as a continuing obligation. A defendant still formally charged with murder, a patient still committed under mental health statutes, a man whose actions had set in motion processes that, years later, had yet to produce a final legal resolution. The basic contours of his trajectory were, by then, well established. He had grown up on Staten Island in an ordinary household, without documented ties to organized crime. As a young adult, he had worked blue-collar jobs and gravitated, like millions of others, to the internet as a primary source of information and belonging. There, he had immersed himself in a swirling network of conspiracy theories, particularly QAnon, whose adherents believed that a hidden cabal of powerful wrongdoers was being secretly opposed by a group of patriots aligned with the president. Intertwined with that immersion, according to later psychiatric assessments, his thinking grew increasingly disordered. He made bizarre attempts to arrest public officials, spoke in grandiose and paranoid terms about his role in a supposed hidden war, and eventually focused his attention, for reasons that remain opaque, on a man law enforcement described as the acting boss of the Gambino crime family. On the night of March 13, 2019, he drove to Francesco, Frankie Boy Cali's home on Hilltop Terrace, staged a minor car crash to draw him out, and shot him at close range in front of his house. The crime shocked a city that had not seen a sitting mafia leader killed in the street in more than 3 decades. Within days, police tracked the pickup used in the attack to him, arrested him in New Jersey, and extradited him to Staten Island to face a second-degree murder charge. In a New Jersey courtroom, he stunned observers by raising a hand inked with QAnon slogans, an image that flashed around the world as a kind of emblem of the case's unsettling blend of old and new forms of American anxiety. What followed, however, did not fit the pattern of past mafia trials or of high-profile political prosecutions. As lawyers and psychiatrists began to examine him, they encountered not a calculating hitman or a coherent ideological militant, but a young man whose grasp on reality appeared seriously compromised. Evaluation after evaluation concluded that he did not adequately understand the structure of the proceedings against him or the role his own lawyer was supposed to play. His thoughts, examiners reported in summaries later described in court, remained dominated by fixed false beliefs about secret missions and special authorizations. On that basis, judges ruled him incompetent to stand trial and ordered him confined to a secure state psychiatric facility, where he would receive treatment aimed at restoring his competency. As of the last publicly available reporting before this documentary was prepared, that status had not changed. He remained in the custody of New York's Office of Mental Health, housed in a forensic hospital under court order, subject to periodic reviews of his condition. The Staten Island indictment for Cali's murder and weapons charges remained pending. Prosecutors continued to state, in response to inquiries, that they intended to bring him to trial if doctors ever certified that he was fit to participate. But no such certification had yet been issued, and no trial date had been set. In practical terms, his life had settled into the routine of long-term institutionalization, bounded by hospital wards rather than prison cells, overseen by clinicians rather than corrections officers, yet still shaped by a crime committed years earlier on a quiet suburban street. That unresolved status left open, in principle, several possible legal paths, each shaped by statutes and medical realities. If at some point he were found competent, the criminal case could resume. He would face the same charges, with the state presenting its evidence, surveillance videos, forensic findings, digital records, witness testimony, and the defense likely emphasizing his mental illness and the impact of conspiratorial beliefs on his perceptions and decisions at the time of the killing. An insanity defense might be raised, arguing that he had been unable to appreciate the nature or wrongfulness of his acts. Alternatively, plea negotiations could occur, seeking some accommodation between recognition of his impairment and the severity of the offense. If, on the other hand, he remained incompetent for a period approaching the maximum sentence he could face if convicted, New York law would require the court to reassess the basis for his continued confinement. In some cases, such reassessments lead to civil commitment in less restrictive psychiatric settings, in others to supervised or conditional release, though the gravity of a past homicide weighs heavily in those determinations. In all scenarios, the law demands a balance between individual rights and public safety, between acknowledging illness and addressing the consequences of violent acts. In his case, that balance had, for the time being, been struck in favor of ongoing secure hospitalization, a middle ground that neither exonerated nor formally punished. For the broader community, the lack of a conventional trial meant that certain questions could not be answered with the clarity that a full adversarial proceeding sometimes brings. A jury never heard, point by point, the state's reconstruction of his movements in the days leading up to March 13, or his own account of what he thought he was doing when he walked up Cali's driveway. Witnesses were not called and cross-examined in open court. The interplay between his psychological condition and his online radicalization, how much of his behavior stemmed from delusion, how much from ideological commitment, how much from the peculiar overlap of the two, remained largely in the realm of expert reports and secondary analysis rather than public testimony. Yet even without that formal airing, the case left a record rich enough to anchor reflection. On one axis stood the history of organized crime in New York. Cali's death marked a rare instance, in the 21st century, of a figure whom investigators regarded as a sitting family leader being killed in an overt, street-level attack. That it happened not as part of an internal power struggle, but apparently at the hands of an outsider with no proven mob affiliation and idiosyncratic motives, underscored how the world that had once birthed and sustained the Gambino family had changed. Where earlier bosses had chiefly feared betrayal from within and surveillance from above, Cali fell victim to a far more chaotic threat, the self-appointed agent of a belief system that bore no relation to the family's own codes and interests. On another axis stood the evolution of conspiracy movements in the internet age. QAnon, the lens through which Comello seemed to interpret much of the world, was not the first conspiratorial narrative to captivate segments of the public, but its structure, decentralized, cryptic, constantly adapting to current events, and its propagation through algorithm-driven platforms gave it an influence that was both wide and unpredictable. His case, along with a handful of others, helped convince many analysts and officials that such movements could not be dismissed as harmless fringe entertainment. When dimly understood political slogans and in-jokes began to define reality for those already struggling with mental stability, the results could be deadly. Overlaying both axes was the enduring challenge of how institutions respond when mental illness, violence, and ideology intersect. In their different ways, the police investigators, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and psychiatrists who handled his case were all operating within systems designed in earlier eras. Criminal law assumed, in broad strokes, that most defendants understood what they were doing and why it was wrong, and that a clear-cut line could be drawn between those few who were legally insane and the many who were not. Mental health systems assumed that clinicians could, with sufficient time and treatment, distinguish between political extremism and psychosis. The internet, with its capacity to nurture and normalize extreme ideas at scale, blurred those lines. In his story, those blurred lines were especially stark. His inked hand in that New Jersey courtroom was, for many who saw the photographs, a symbol of defiance or allegiance. For psychiatrists reading his later file, it might have looked more like evidence of a mind organizing its fragmenting experiences around the only narrative framework that still seemed to make sense to him, however fantastical. For prosecutors, it was part of a potential argument that he embraced his beliefs and acted on them voluntarily. For the families injured by his actions, it changed little. A man they loved had been killed. Whatever mix of illness and ideology animated the accused, the harm could not be undone. Amid these systemic reflections, the human cost of the crime remained stubbornly simple. On one side, the Cali family lived with the loss of a father and husband whose life, for all its alleged entanglements with organized crime, had also contained private roles that had nothing to do with federal indictments or mob charts. On the other, the Comello family lived with the knowledge that their son's name had become inseparable from a killing that the evidence indicated he had committed, and that his life going forward would likely be bounded by locks and staff schedules rather than the freedoms he had once taken for granted. Neither family had sought this intersection. Both were left to navigate its consequences. For those looking back on the case years later, it is tempting to search for easy lessons. To say that if only certain warning signs had been heeded, or certain content more aggressively moderated, or certain treatments more swiftly provided, the driveway confrontation might never have occurred. There is some truth in such impulses. Early intervention in mental illness can make a difference, and social environments do shape individual behavior. But the record of his life resists reduction to a simple morality tale. Many people consume conspiracy-laden content without descending into violence. Many people struggle with psychosis without ever harming others. The particular combination of factors that led him to Hilltop Terrace at that moment in March 2019, his personal history, his mental state, the online narratives he embraced, the presence of Cali in that house, is unlikely to be replicated exactly. What can be drawn from his story, with more confidence, are certain cautions. One is that the boundaries between online fantasy and offline action are more porous than they might appear, especially for individuals whose grip on reality is already fragile. Another is that institutions built to address traditional forms of crime must continue to adapt to threats that emerge from networked subcultures rather than from hierarchical organizations. A third is that the long-standing tension between treating mental illness and punishing criminal conduct will only grow more complicated as ideological and conspiratorial frames become more accessible to those in distress. In the end, the life of Anthony Comello, as it is known through public records, is not a story of rise and fall in the conventional sense. There is no arc of ascent to power, no clear moment of dramatic repentance or transformation. There is instead a movement from anonymity to notoriety, from a modest Staten Island upbringing to a single act of lethal violence, from the broad world of internet-fueled belief into the confined spaces of jails and hospitals. Along the way, his case illuminated fault lines in how American society understands crime, madness, and the stories we tell ourselves about hidden enemies and heroic missions. As of the last available accounts, he remained in that suspended state, accused but not tried, confined but not sentenced, a figure whose name appears both in homicide dockets and in psychiatric ledgers. For the families, communities, and institutions touched by his actions, the absence of a clean legal endpoint may be unsatisfying. But it is, in its own way, a faithful reflection of the complexities his case exposed. In a time when the lines between reality and invention, illness and ideology, private grievance and public violence can blur so swiftly, neat resolutions are often the first casualty.